In this interview, I'm going to be talking to political scientist Lisa Young from the University of Calgary about the recent Value of Freedom document that was put out by the Alberta Prosperity Project, the Separatists. And it has a section in there on deportation of immigrants. And that conjures up images of US President Donald Trump and his infamous Alligator Alcatraz. So that's what we're going to talk about. So welcome to the interview, Lisa.
Happy to be here.
This whole idea of immigration is really taking off in Alberta, and it's like a myth. It's a narrative. There's really no foundation for it, is it? Because it's a federal issue. There are no more immigrants pouring into Alberta, it would appear, than there has at any other time. And yet it has become an issue for the separatists.
Well, I think, there are a lot of things going on here, right? So, first of all, we do know that the Trudeau government pursued an immigration policy that really did increase the rate of immigration quite significantly, and particularly for people who were sort of temporary residents in a variety of ways. And so we saw, a backlash against that. We saw the federal government reduce immigration numbers in response to that. So, that has taken place in Alberta as it has in other places. But what we've seen, and it's not just from the Separatists, but also from the Smith government with its Alberta Next panel, is an effort to take anti-Ottawa sentiments and sort of channel it against immigrants themselves, right? And so the first piece of this was the Alberta Next panel, where one of the topics for conversation was around immigration. And there were statements in the video that you have to watch in order to fill out the survey, to the effect that high immigration rates were the reason for shortages of housing and for unemployment, right? So a bit of blaming immigrants for public policy problems that are within the provincial area of jurisdiction. And then the question of whether only Alberta approved immigrants should be ones to get social services like healthcare, right? So opening up that conversation and tying it to the anti-Ottawa sentiments. So then we get the Alberta Prosperity Project, which comes out with this long document about, how an independent Alberta would operate. And there's a big section on both immigration and deportations, right? That's in the headline. And so a lot of what we see here is, again, this idea that immigrants who've come to Alberta since 2015 are, in some instances, deficient because they were let in by the Trudeau government. So again, it's this effort to sort of take that anti-Ottawa, anti-Trudeau sentiment and target immigrants with it.
And part of the problem with the Alberta Prosperity document is it actually talks about deporting immigrants, correct?
Well, yeah, when I got the document, I read the table of contents. It's a long document, and was really surprised to see that there was a section that was headed immigration and deportation, right? And it goes through in a fair bit of detail what the immigration policy would be for the free Alberta. And so, people in the rest of Canada will be happy to hear that, they're at the front of the line for immigrating to the free Alberta, or maybe they won't be happy. But people who were born in Canada get preference. People who are just naturalized Canadians, people who have become citizens, don't get as many points in this scheme. And the reasoning is basically that the APP folks think that, if you were born in Canada, you'll fit in, and also you'll know how to drive in the snow. That was actually in the document. So there we are. I don't know if they've ever been in Victoria in a snowstorm, but that's a whole other conversation.
Well, I guess the idea here is that only from Finland and Norway and Sweden, those are the only immigrants allowed?
Well, the idea is that if you were born in Canada, then you know how to drive in the snow, and that's an important value. So I'm kind of making fun of them here because they included that. But, I think what they're really trying to get at here is, they'd like, immigrants from the rest of Canada who look more like us and less like the folks that they think of as immigrants, right? That there's a racial dimension to that they're not saying out loud.
Well, I'll say it out loud. I mean, essentially, this is brown skins don't apply. And and I can see why there would be a lot of people in Calgary upset because the that city in particular has a very large community of folks from Muslims and folks and Sikhs and other people.
Huge South Asian community.
South
Absolutely.
Asian
Yeah.
community. That's right,
Yeah.
exactly right. But that's also true in some of the other cities. I mean, that just is a part of modern Canada, and Alberta didn't somehow get excluded from it.
No, that's exactly right. And and then what we see in this Alberta Prosperity Project document is then an effort to kind of undo the so-called wrongs of the Trudeau immigration policy and to retroactively evaluate everyone who immigrated, to Canada in Alberta since 2015 to see if they get to stay, right? And that's where we get to deportations. And so there's a careful point system, and if you don't get enough points on this system, and it has to do with things like education and various values. You can only get 10 points for being healthy if you haven't had major illnesses and you haven't had an experimental COVID COVID shot. So there's all kinds of things wrapped in here. In any event, the notion then is that anyone who doesn't pass the reapplication procedure will then be deported either to where they came from or, better yet, to Ottawa. Not to the rest of Canada, but they're all going to Ottawa.
Oh,
So
if I understand this correctly now, I mean, we brought in, I don't know how many temporary foreign workers, and a lot of them worked in industries, like meatpacking, where the industries were, there was a real shortage of labor. You see a lot of in the hospitality industry in Alberta are, staffed by folks who came in under a program like that. So they arrive in late 2015, 2016, and they get established, they have a family, they have jobs, they bought a house, whatever. And now they may face the prospect of losing their citizenship in a separate Alberta and being deported. Is that is that what I'm
that's
reading
my
it?
understanding of the document. Um,
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, this looks very much like Trump's America. I was reading just this morning about this Alligator Alcatraz. So it's a very, very large, basically it looks like a concentration camp. It's metal fencing in basically cages of metal fencing with bunk beds, and people will be taken there. It's like 60, 70 kilometers out into the outside of Miami, deep in the Florida Everglades. They made a big deal about the fact that, well, nobody's going to escape because they'll be eaten by an alligator. There's alligators all over the place and pythons. And this is the kind of brutality that we're seeing south of the border. And this document just seems to mirror that.
Well, to be fair to these folks, right, who've written the document, there's no notion of rounding people up and putting them in places like Trump is setting up. It's a very tidy, very rule of law kind of process, right? We're going to have points you have to apply. If you don't make it, well, there's no notion of imprisoning people, just sending them to Ottawa. And Ottawa in February is miserable, but it's not Alcatraz, and it's not in the Everglades. So I don't want to overstate this, but I do think that there's indications here of some influence by of the watching what's going on in the United States, right? There's so much emphasis right now on deportation in the United States, rounding people up and so on. And you can see that there's, a bit of a desire to go in that direction, although not with the same lawlessness that we're seeing in the United States.
Right, except that every Canadian understands that whatever happens in the United States wafts over the border 5 years later. So while they may say at this point, we're not prepared to go that far, the fact that they're willing to go in that direction as far
Yeah.
as they're going ought to make Canadians awfully nervous as far as I'm concerned.
Well, absolutely. And I think, Canada has had an enviable consensus around immigration, right? An idea that, immigration is important to the country, that we need to, find ways to get along as a more diverse country, right? And this has broken down to some extent in response to the high levels of immigration that we've seen, coming out of the Trudeau government. And I think that as that has broken down, and as we're seeing the kind of, I think, blatant racism of the Trump administration, it's created a bit of space for people to say things out loud that they might not have felt comfortable saying out loud in the past.
Given that you're a political scientist, let's talk about populism for a moment, because a defining feature of populist politicians and governments is there needs to be an other. There needs to be an enemy. There needs to be someone that you can elevate to the level of a threat to the community. That then the populist politician says, "I'm the only one who can help save this. These people are taking our jobs. These people are posing a security threat to us, and I can save you from them. Vote for me." There's always another, and it's very disturbing that now it appears that certainly in the US, immigrants are the other and have been for a long time since Trump 1.0, and now we're seeing that in Canada, and it's a disturbing trend.
Yeah, I agree. And in political science circles, there's been a lot of talk about how Canada has been the exception to the populism that we've seen elsewhere in the world. And the people who make that argument basically point to the absence of what's called nativism, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about here. The perception that immigrants are a threat to the virtuous people. And, I've never been convinced by that argument because I think there's other forms of populism. And so what we've seen in Alberta, what we see all the time is what we can call regionalist populism, right? That there's the virtuous people of Alberta and the evil, self-interested elite in Ottawa. And so part of what alarms me so much in what I saw from the Alberta Prosperity Project document and from the Smith government is an attempt to take that regional populism and morph it into a nativist populism where it becomes anti-immigrant, right? And so that I think is a really toxic development in our politics.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Lisa. Is this not a classic slippery slope argument? That once you've opened the door to this, that it's very hard to stop it going, especially when you've got developments that are more extreme down in the United States.
Yeah, I think, what we saw during the first Trump administration was that, the overt expressions of racism, the guys with their tiki torches and so on, created a little bit of space in Canada to say things out loud that people might have believed, in the quiet of their own homes, but weren't willing to say out loud. And I think we're seeing it in spades in this second Trump administration, which has gone so much further. And so, some of the things, the attacks on equity, diversity, and inclusion are absolutely playing out here. Now we're having this conversation, from the fringe still, right? But the fringe finds its way in about the idea of deportations. We are very vulnerable to being influenced by what's happening in the United States because we are, even when we're mad at them, so incredibly tightly linked to them.
I remember 3 or 4 years ago when the anti-vax movement started up, and it was also a fringe movement, and then it became more mainstream and was picked up by the Freedom and the Convoy crowd. And today, as of it didn't start this year; it's been around for a while since Danielle Smith became Premier of Alberta. Now they openly court it. I mean, the remember that panel they had about vaccine safety and so on. So what starts out on the fringe not that long ago, a year or two, quickly becomes much more mainstream, and that I think is the danger of the Alberta Prosperity Project's proposal, as it were.
Absolutely. I will think about that as I'm paying for my COVID vaccine in the fall.
Good for you, Lisa. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.